Hi guys, welcome to week 9 of our video discussion for our book club. I'm coming to you guys in a video that I'll post later because our Wi-Fi has been spotty, so I'm not sure if I can do a live video without being interrupted a lot, so I'm gonna have to figure that out. But for today, I'm just gonna do this video like this, and then I'll post it on my Instagram channel and also on my blog. And maybe next week I'll have the Wi-Fi and stuff figured out so I can do another live video. But for now, let's get started on week 9. We finished, we read pages 154 to 168 this past week. Last week actually, I'm running a little behind on my videos, trying really hard to keep up, but the days are just catching up to me too quick. But we finished part 4, some habits of mind, some moral habits, this last week. And so she talked a lot about ethical and moral training this week in addition to last week. So we'll go ahead and get started. She started out this section talking about the habit of remembering. And she says that memory is the storehouse of whatever knowledge we possess. And this is what makes us intelligent beings, is our ability to remember things. And we're teaching our children in order that they remember. That's kind of our goal of educating our kids. We want them to remember what they've been taught. So whether we realize it or not, and whether we remember all the things or not, our notions and opinions all stem from our memory and what we've been exposed to, which she's talked about a lot. And we might not be able to remember all the things, but they're in there somewhere, and they have kind of formed our ideas. So she says that this ability for us to draw upon our memories, it's our very most valuable endowment as human beings. Which, I mean, it is. It's miraculous when you think about it. Our ability to remember things that happened years and years ago, or just to remember information. It's amazing that our brains can do these things and store these things. She talks about another kind of memory, which she calls spurious memory. Spurious, I don't know how to say spurious. But she says it's kind of like whenever you cram for a test and then you go take the test and you spill out all this information and then you just forget it forever. You don't even remember what you studied last night. But she says it's an important ability that our brains need to be able to do this, but at the same time, what about the schoolboy, she says, who hasn't retained any information all year? That's a problem. So we have to find the balance between, the things we need to remember versus the things we can just kind of let slip away and we don't necessarily need that information. She says that our memory is a record in the brain substance. So she asks a lot of questions that are kind of rhetorical questions, like how do we have the ability to remember? And why is this knowledge only available sometimes for a little while and then gone forever? Like, how does this work? I'm not sure that we even now know how all of these things in the brain work, but it is curious to think about, like, how does this even work? How do our brains hold on to these things, and how do they decide what needs to go? It's an interesting thought. But she says this is that function of the brain. This is just how things are in our brains. So, under what conditions are these imprints made? The important pieces of information that we seem to hold on to longer, are these things permanent? Is the brain capable of storing an indefinite number of memories? I'm not sure the answer to that. I'm not sure she had the answer to that, but they were thought-provoking questions, and I think that's what she kind of wanted us to think about, was how does this work? And she says that it seems like any idea that's regarded with attention for a longer period of time, where your brain is, or your thoughts are focused on this idea, these things tend to become memories and our brains hold on to them longer. In other words, give an instant's undivided attention to anything whatsoever, and that thing will be remembered. So if you want a child to remember, she says, you have to secure his whole attention upon that which you want remembered. So very interesting. And then she goes on to talk about the law of association. And she says we don't want to just have these recollections flash across our mind accidentally or incidentally. We want to have the power to recall them at will. And she says we have to provide more than like one impression of a certain fact in order for our children to retain it and hold on to it and be able to recall it at will later on. So she gave the example of layering our lessons on any subject like links in a chain. So I loved this metaphor of the chain links, to where she talked about like dipping a bucket into a well for water. You have to have the chain, but each link links to the one before it or behind it, and they all kind of layer. And when you're doing lessons, you should think of it in this, with this idea of the links in a chain, and all of the chain links are somehow related or associated to the next one. And that, she says, is how you will really be able to like get to the well, or fill the well with all the knowledge you're really hoping to pour into your child. You want to have these lessons relate to each other. So she says, this is to make a practical use of that law of association of ideas, of which one would not willingly become the sport, and it is the neglect of this law which invalidates much good teaching. So whenever we're not layering our lessons on top of each other, it may have been a great lesson, but if you don't introduce it over and over again and make these ideas relate to each other, she says, it's more likely gonna be lost in the abyss of our memories. So she said, let every lesson gain the child's entire attention, and let each new lesson be so interlaced with the last that the one must recall the other. But you see that a lot, I feel like, in math lessons, in a good math curriculum, where you will repeat the same kind of problems for several lessons in a row and build upon that. And that is how the child gets to where they remember how this process of, working out the math problem goes and how it works. So she kind of says it's like that in anything you want them to remember. We put so much emphasis on remembering math facts, but the reason that works is because you're doing it over and over again. Well, if you want them to remember other things, it makes sense to kind of follow the same format of, we recall the last lesson each time we layer on top of each lesson. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So Charlotte says there's no limit to the recording power of the brain. And she says whenever we have the full gaze of our mind focused on the information at hand, given these conditions, there appears to be no limit of quantity to the recording power of the brain, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. So in order for this information to be accessible for a lifetime, it's important that it must be used frequently. Otherwise, it will slowly fade and be forgotten. So, I've seen that to be true in my own life of however many years it's been since I was in school. And so much of what I learned is I haven't used it, so it's gone forever. Like Spanish. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, and I remember like 12 phrases. Okay. But links of association are a condition of recollection. So Charlotte speaks about layering lessons like links in a chain. I already mentioned that. Making sure that each link is somehow associated to the last. When there is no association, the lesson becomes almost useless. So this had me thinking about our own, homeschooling. And why don't you remember this? We just talked about this last week. Well, it's because I talked about it once and then never mentioned it again. Of course he doesn't remember, like, duh. But this is why we're reading this book, so we can learn, right? Okay, the habit of perfect execution. So this was interesting as well. She talked about creating a habit of expecting your children to turn in perfect work every time. And she says, throw perfection into all you do is a counsel upon which a family may be brought up with great advantage. So we have the option, she says, that we can teach their children, oh, you'll get better by and by. As time goes on, you'll get better at it. Or we can teach them to take their time and do what they can perfectly every single time. And she argues that allowing children to form the habit of imperfect work will likely mean that habit will accompany them into their adulthood. So that's something to think about, whenever you're allowing them to kind of go do halfway work, then what kind of habit are we forming if we're not expecting them to give us their very best work every time? I mentioned my oldest son's handwriting. It was like pulling teeth to get him to write, so I just was like, whatever, dude, just do what you can. Instead of, I think, expecting less in quantity, but more in quality. So, okay, this is hard for you. This is what I should have said. I didn't, and it had, the results I wasn't looking for. But she talked about how, give the young child an assignment that they can do. If it's too difficult, give them 6-letter A's or whatever it is you're working on, and have them do those 6-letter A's just to the very perfection that they can possibly reach. And she said, don't let them turn in a page full of sloppy A's. You don't want more that isn't good. You want less that's borderline perfect, as good as they can do it. So that's a whole new, to me, it took me a couple of kids to figure this out. And I'm glad I did, change my perspective on this, because the poor oldest, they're like the guinea pigs and they get all your mistakes, But if with him I had been more patient and expected less, then I think it wouldn't have been such a headache for him or for me. Mostly for him, because the poor guy he's like, this is so many letters on this whole page of handwriting and I'm only in first grade. So I love this, that she said, just give them 6. Have them do perfect little A's and then be done. And then you build up from there. So this is a new idea, I think, for a lot of people, especially whenever you've bought a curriculum and not just handwriting, any curriculum, and there's like pages and pages and they're little bitty and they just can't even focus that long. So anyways, I'll get off my soapbox. But so she says, tomorrow he can do the same exercise again and the next until his execution is perfect the very first time. Then she goes on to talking about moral habits. And she talked a lot about obedience and honesty. But she started with obedience and said that it's the whole duty of a child. She said the most important moral habit of a child is obedience. And this is what Charlotte calls the whole duty of the child. Because every other duty that a child has stems from this one thing, obedience, and being able to obey their parents whenever they're asked to do something. And she said, not only so, obedience is the whole duty of man. Obedience to conscience, to law, to divine direction. This is one of those things, like, it makes us human, that we obey, and that we follow the rules, or that we, and these are habits we make in childhood. And she gave the example of the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. And she said these weren't these temptations weren't, tempting him to just outright sin, do this bad thing. They were an act of his willfulness, suggesting that he should choose his will over God's will. And she says, willfulness is that state directly opposed to obedience, and out of which springs all that foolishness which is bound up in the heart of a child. So if we can get our children in the habit of obedience, so much more good stems from just being able to, submit to your parents' authority and do as you're asked to do. She says that obedience is no accidental duty. It's the parent's duty to teach that obedience is not accidental. As parents, we are the appointed agent to train the child up to the intelligent obedience of the self-compelling, law-abiding human being. Every act of disobedience on the child's part is a direct condemnation of the parent. And we must also remember that strong-arming children into obedience typically backfires, and it does not strengthen their will to obey, which she talks more about in this next section, which is titled Children Must Have the Desire to Obey. So he obeys because his sense of right makes him desire to obey in spite of temptations to disobedience, not of constraint, but willingly. That the habit has been formed which will hereafter enable the child to use the strength of his will against his inclinations when these prompt him to lawless courses. So she mentioned that it's often said that children who are, strong-armed into being obedient end up rebelling when they get older, which, we've seen it. And she said it's true because they've been taught, you obey because I say so. But she said this isn't the way you inspire them to obey. There's a difference between demanding them to obey and, inspiring them to obey. And it takes time, she says. They're taught over the course of time that obedience is their willful duty, and it's a good and upright decision which strengthens their moral will the older they get. And I think back to, past sections where she talked about the natural, what word did she use? Reward. The natural reward for, doing your work whenever you're told or whatever. I think there are natural rewards to obedience as well, which she didn't really get into that, but this kind of made me think of those past sections where I think really encouraging and building them up when they do obey, and making sure that you let them know how proud you are of them when they obey, and not condemn them when they disobey. I don't know, it's a one of those things that's done over time, I guess, and you just kind of have to work at it. And I mean, I don't know all the answers. I don't know how you just make a child obey, but I think, like she said, it's over the course of time, and they're growing into this habit, and we have to be gentle with them, and understanding when they get it wrong, and not condemning when they step out of line, but understanding, okay, I get it, I know, but this would have been the better thing to do, right? Because then, these good things come, that type of thing, I think that was what this section was kind of saying to me. Then she goes on to talking about how a mother should expect obedience, and she said you can even train your infant to obey, because whenever they're little bitty, they have the natural principle of obedience within them. They're not rebellious from the get-go usually. So she said there's no need to scold them or threaten them or use violence to receive obedience. She said it's enough to say, do this, and expect it to be done. And she says a mother usually loses her authority when the children detect doubt in her voice, because she doesn't really expect them to obey, and they can sense it. We talked about that before too, where they just know, the little creatures of, you read your mind, and they know, she doesn't really mean it, so then they don't do it. And I have a couple that do that. So we have to be firm and confident in ourselves in order to get the results, because if we say it and don't mean it, they're gonna know. So we have to mean it when we say it. And she says that the mother doesn't think enough of her position, and she has not sufficient confidence in her own authority. But she says our greatest tool is the habit of obedience. If she begins by requiring obedience, then they will always obey. But once they discover otherwise, the struggle for obedience has begun. So she says, to avoid these displays of willfulness, the mother will insist from the first on in obedience which is prompt, cheerful, and lasting, save for lapses of memory on the child's part. So as the child gets older and matures, the mother can let him know what a noble and upright thing it is to have the ability and be in the habit of doing those things that must be done with a joyful heart, even if it's a thing he would rather not do. And I think of my 12-year-old, he's always been very obedient for some reason. I'm not like taking credit here. He's just a very laid back kind of guy. He always kind of wants to please and enjoys doing things for others. And now that he's old enough, it's so nice to be able to say, you know, dude, I'm so glad that you just listen when I tell you to, because it's just so nice to have a kid who will obey me whenever I ask him to. And you don't know what a burden that is off my shoulders to just ask you to do something and know that you'll get it done. And for me to, I think, vocalize that to him just totally boosts up his, morale, and of course makes him want to help out and do it with a happy heart too, not do it begrudgingly. So, yeah, like she said, when the older they get, let them know, thank you, you're such a help to me. That is such a huge, burden off of my shoulders for you to help me out, and I so appreciate all you do. And I think letting them know that is such a huge deal to them. So she says, to secure this habit of obedience, the mother should never give a command that she doesn't expect to be carried out to the full. And she must not lay upon her children burdens grievous to be borne, of command heaped upon command. So this is kind of similar to, the handwriting we talked about a minute ago. She's like, don't give them more than they can handle, because of course they're not going to be able to do it. And then that just puts stress on them and you. And that kind of works against what we're trying to get at here. We're not trying to get at, like she said, do this because I say so. We're trying to get at, let's build you up in the habit of doing these things so that the further on down the road we go, you can, take responsibility for more, you're capable of more, and by then you're in the habit of, obeying and doing what you're told, and seeing the results of your hard work too. That is such a huge thing for a child, even for grown-ups, to see after I've done all this work and invested all this time and energy into this, but wow, look at the result, look at how great this is, that I got this done, look at what I did. That feels good to kids too. So we shouldn't expect them to do something they're not capable of. Give them chores or tasks or whatever that their little bodies and little minds are capable of doing. And then we won't have to stand over them saying, wah, 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 you didn't do this, look at what you didn't do. Which I am guilty of doing that. But, we try better next time. Okay. And then she talked about law ensures liberty, which, she says the more a child has been trained in the habit of perfect obedience, the more freedom he can be given on down the road, because now we've built this bridge of trust between me and you. I know that whenever I ask you to do something, you will do it, and you will do it, rightly. And so, now I can give you a simple task and then let you be, and you can kind of do it within your own self-will and power. And I don't have to lord my influence over you in order to get it done. Which, again, I see this in my oldest, now that he's kind of getting on up in age. It's so nice to just say, go can you just get this done? And he'll do it, and I just let him be to do it. I don't have to stand behind him to make sure he does it. That doesn't mean I don't have to correct him sometimes, because I do, because he is still young. He's not an adult yet. But I see the difference between like my oldest and my younger ones, and how I do still have to kind of guide the little ones in what task they're doing. But with the older ones, because he's been trained to, this is what I expect, he can just get it done without my help or input, which is more valuable to him than it is to me, I think. Okay, back to what I was saying. I had a phone call, so I got interrupted. Anyways, this ability to take control of your actions, I feel like is more beneficial to our children even than it is to us, because now they're becoming their own, person with their own self-will and self-confidence, and that just is such a benefit to them in the long run. Okay, so she goes on to talk about truthfulness, and she says that, truthfulness is of the most value, and it requires delicate care and consistency on our part to make sure that our children are honest little people. And she says there's 3 causes of deceit: carelessness in ascertaining the truth, carelessness in stating the truth, and deliberate intention to deceive. She said all of these are vicious, whether we realize it or not, because even just careless talking can ruin somebody's reputation. But she says that it seems like children are only reprimanded for the 3rd type, which is deliberate lying, when we know they're deliberately telling a fib. But we tend to let them get away with the exaggerations or the stating things that aren't quite true because they're little. But she says the more often we allow these inconsistencies, the more likely there is to be damage to a child's sense of truth. A blade which easily loses its keenness of edge. Which, that is such a great sentence right there. But truth is a blade which easily loses its keenness of edge. So if we allow the little things to go unchecked, she says, then it's a slippery slope. So she tells us we should train our children to speak accurately, and it will help strengthen their will to be honest at all times in all things. He won't color a tale to his own advantage or suppress facts or any of those types of things. She says we should also be really careful to prevent them from getting in the habit of exaggeration or over-embellishing. And this actually made me think of my husband, because he's a storyteller in a good way. He likes to tell stories and, be all theatrical and, and he does like exaggerate sometimes. Like recently he was telling a story about a dog, and he's like, this dog, his back came up to here. And I'm like, there is no dog on 4 legs who comes up to your eyeballs. But that is just, I give him a hard time. But I understand what she's saying too. Like, we don't want to allow our children to always exaggerate and tell little fibs, because the little fibs can become bigger fibs. Which I just joke about my husband, but that made me think of him and his story about the exaggerated dog the size of a horse. But anyways, she says that we should put a reverence on the importance of teaching our children. We should put an emphasis, not a reverence. An emphasis on the importance of teaching our children reverence, consideration for others, respect for persons and properties. So she said that in her time, and then also in our time, these things are a lot of the times they're neglected. They're not taught to our children, and we see the repercussions of that in our society all around us. So it's our duty, just for our little world, within your little world is what you can control, and we need to put an emphasis on these things: teaching the children reverence, consideration for others, and respect for other people and property. Then she goes on to talk about temper, which she talked about the difference between the temper you're born with or the tendencies you grow into. And she says a lot of times people will describe a little a child as having an ill temper or a good temper, they're just the calmest, sweetest baby ever, or he's a little stinker, and they kind of excuse it as if there's nothing you can do to change the qualities that aren't so great. But she says you can change these things because they're not permanent. You are capable of molding them into, to have the better temperament than the negative ones maybe that are kind of inherent to them. She says, here, if anywhere, the power of habit is invaluable. It rests with the parents to correct the original twist, all the more so if it is from them that the child gets it, and to send their child into the world blessed with an even happy temper. So, whether it's like you are hot-headed, or maybe your kid inherited that, or like maybe you're super, super shy to a fault. That's me. I do not like approaching people in conversation, and I see that in some of my boys, and that's one of those things I'm gonna have to, tell them the results of this aren't that great. Like you're gonna have to speak up and speak out, because you don't want to end up like me, an adult unable to engage in conversation in a group of people. So if it's something you struggle with too, that's actually all the better, because you can kind of empathize with where they're coming from and explain to them, why this needs to be fixed, because I struggle with this too, and it stinks, but we can change it. Let's work on it together. Okay. Parents must correct tendency by new habit of temper. She says it's by force of habit that a tendency becomes a temper. So as mothers, we have the ability to stop these bad tendencies in their tracks before they make a mark that can't be removed on their, the ruts in their brain that she talked about a few weeks ago. While they're very young, their minds are still tender and pliable, and this is when we have the greatest chance of kind of redirecting any thoughts that maybe are ugly or hurtful or envious or, discontented, any of those kind of negative thoughts. We don't want them to be in the habit of their mind going down that rut and creating a habit that, is hard to remove. Instead, she says, we need to step in before those thoughts take a foothold and give them something else to think about, which is kind of hard, because you really got to be watchful then if you don't want it to become a habit and constantly being correcting, and but she says to do it in a way that they're not even aware that you're correcting them. So she says, have them go do a task for you, have them go take a walk, have them, any kind of distract them from these negative thoughts. And I think, if we think about our own, as adults, how do we kind of step over those roadblocks in our mind that prevent us from having good thoughts? I don't know. I think it'll be different for every kid and different for every mom. But I think just to be aware that this is something we should be correcting is the first step to successfully correcting it, and noticing them and trying to be on the spot and really thinking, okay, what can we do to kind of get his mind off of this and go a different direction? And even talk to them about it too sometimes if need be. A lot of times they're very responsive if you just have a conversation with them. Not that I'm perfect at that, because I'm not, but yeah, that's just a thought, to talk to them about it as well. Okay, so, and then she says, also make every effort to encourage the thoughts that are positive. Those are the good things. We want to build those up and cultivate them and encourage them in our children. Okay, so she wraps up this chapter by saying that there are so many topics she could have talked about, but she wanted to cover those things in ethical training that she feels like most thoughtful people view as important. Honesty, obedience, training into the good tendencies to create a good temperament. So that was the end of this chapter. and a lot of things to think about this past week, and just a really good chapter altogether. I think teaching moral habits is really important, and like she said, really neglected a lot of the time. But aren't we fortunate that, if you're a homeschooler like me, that we have all day long to kind of be slowly cultivating these things within our homes, within the hearts of our children and ourselves too, because we need that too. Okay, so that concludes our reading. Next week we're going to start part 5, lessons as instruments of education, and we're reading pages 169 to 181. So just 11-12 pages. Hooray, it's a short week, so it should be pretty easy to get through it. And I'll try next week to do a live video, and hopefully on our regular day, and not be so late in the week. I hope you guys will give me some grace for being so behind. But it is getting dark here. The sun has officially gone down, so I'm going to close this video. And if you guys have questions, please let me know. I'm sorry it wasn't live, but do please interact if you can. Send me a message, send me a comment, anything, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. I will see you all next week. Bye, guys.